the intention behind this series is to open the conversations about strategy and different approaches to nonviolent direct action, and to reveal the differences that we have and be able to really engage in dialogue about those differences and see where our common ground is as well. Tonight we'll hear several stories about working with nonviolent direct action campaigns. I have a couple of announcements. This is the third in a series of 5 events. On Saturday, we have a nonviolent warrior training that's going to be conducted by Training for Change. And we still have places, and we're accepting applications through Thursday. So if you haven't applied, feel free to do so. And AFSC is contributing about half of the amount for that training, and we would be we would greatly receive contributions. It's going to we need to raise about $40 per participant. And if there's more participants, less per participant. So if anyone would like to help contribute to that, we'd really appreciate it. Although we won't keep anybody out of it for lack of funds, of course. But we would take contributions for Training for Change for that. And please come join us. I think it will be exciting. The list of participants is already pretty exciting. And the last event in the series is next Monday. We're going to watch A Force More Powerful, which is a documentary about nonviolent direct action and how it's worked throughout several campaigns in history. And then we'll have a facilitated conversation informed by all the previous conversations, we hope. And also, if you want to hear about future events, there's sign-up sheets in the back. Put your name down and we'll send you an email. And if you're interested in working with us on planning future events, we'd love to have you participate. And there's a checkbox for you to sign that.
I'm going to circulate this now.
Yeah, go ahead. And if somebody can circulate the revolutionary nonviolence applications too, that would be great. Those are on the back. And I wanted you to know that this event is being videotaped and it's also being live streamed by Occupy Philly, so that others that aren't in the room can participate. So, it was wonderful to hear David Solnit, if you got a chance to hear him, set this series up and talk about the importance of being strategic in our nonviolent direct action work, and the importance of stories, of having a narrative that we are telling about what we're doing, and a narrative from which we learn from the past so that we can live into the future. And Barry Lopez, in his book Crow and Weasel, says that sometimes we need a story more than food to stay alive. And it seems that right now is a time when we need stories of what the future might look like, and what the past successes in nonviolent direct action have looked like, what's worked, what hasn't worked, so that we can make together a new story and live into a new story of a new world. So I'm really excited to get to hear these stories tonight. And we have the great privilege of having this facilitated tonight by Jody Dodd, who is a longtime Philly activist. And if you've been to Jail for Justice, you probably know her. And if you don't, maybe it's time. Thank you for coming.
Yeah. So if I haven't seen you lately in jail, where are you? So, hi, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. I've been asked to facilitate the storytellers, but I kind of want to just really briefly tell you how we hope this night will be structured. And that is that we are going to ask each of our storytellers to tell their story for about 10 minutes. And then we are going to have, after all of the stories have been told, we are going to have about a 15-minute question and answer period so that we can get some interaction. But we really wanted this to be very more interactive. And what we know is, and I'm looking around this room, and I know for a fact that there are stories to be told by some of the folks, and by all of us in this room, about campaigns that we've worked on, successes that we've had, failures that we have to also talk about, things that didn't work so well. So we're going to structure this, we're going to break into small groups, and from listening to these stories, talk a little bit about some of the things that maybe, if we haven't personally participated, things that we've observed or read about, and whatever that feedback was, to talk a little bit about strategies for nonviolence, and then also to talk about how we can learn from these experiences to bring it into our work today to move forward as we build a movement. And then we're going to come back together as a whole group and just kind of share some of what's come out of the small group discussion. So that's how this evening has been structured. And I'm not going to take up any more time because I think everyone came here to hear the stories. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first storyteller. Val Pinguel is, I have to just say on a personal note, one of my heroes. Val was the director of the Peace Building and Prevention of Conflict program for AFSC. And prior to his work in AFSC, Val was an anti-dictatorship activist and a founding officer of Bayan, the largest anti-dictatorship grassroots coalition in the Philippines during the martial law years. He was the director of the Popular Struggle Commission of Bayan that developed the concept of Welgang Bayan, or People Strike. Welgang Bayan was ultimately embraced by the Filipino people in the nonviolent overthrow of Philippine dictator Fernando Marcos. The EDSA revolution of 1986 in the Philippines was the first in what is termed now as People Power Revolution. It is my honor to have Val come and tell his story. Here's Val.
Thank you, Jody. That was a very wonderful introduction. Regarding my story, as mentioned by Jody, I was an anti-dictatorship activist in the Philippines. In fact, before the imposition of martial law in the Philippines in 1972, I was the national spokesperson of the largest youth organization in the Philippines called Kabataang Makabayan, which at the time in 1971 embraced around 75,000 members all over the Philippines. It was such militant organizations, and together with other organizations, we protested the issues at the time. Firstly, in Southeast Asia, because that is where the Philippines is located, we object to the fact that the Philippines was involved in the war in Vietnam. And we want our country to disengage itself from Vietnam because we were sending troops, like people, engineering kind of, company or something that were constructing the roads and the bridges that were being used by the U.S. in the counter-insurgency war in Vietnam. And then that opened my eyes a little bit further to look into the very issues in my own country. And behold, through that involvement, I became aware about the existence of the U.S. military bases in the Philippines. The largest military bases of the U.S. was in the Philippines at that time. That if you take contiguously the several bases that we have, like Clark Air Base and Subic Naval Base, it encompasses a land territory that is larger or equivalent to the country of Singapore. That is how large the U.S. military base was. It was never a part of the Philippine territory. It was a place where the flag of the U.S. perpetually, unfurled and waved since 1898, after the conquest of the Philippines from Spain. At any rate, the struggle that I participated in was the anti-dictatorship struggle, because we used to have a president called Ferdinand Marcos, who was one of the most loyal, I might say, president in Southeast Asia, because the Philippines was always the site for the meetings that the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization was doing in relation to Vietnam. And so a lot of demonstration taking place in the Philippines also targeted the fact that our president was very compliant to what the U.S. wanted to do or was doing in Vietnam. So that was my first involvement in the anti-Vietnam struggle. And in the span of 1 year, I think the organization and the movement grew so large to a point that from the perspective of the Philippine dictator Marcos, and I think from the perspective of the people behind Marcos, like the U.S. government, this was a serious threat to their existence. So martial law was declared September 1972. And I, being one of the more outspoken leader at the time, was immediately transformed into a wanted personality, and there were posters and rewards for my arrest. I eluded escape. I eluded arrest for more than a year, and then I got arrested while organizing a student in another part of outside Manila. But I think I only stayed in prison for 1.5 months, and then with 8 others, we did the first mass jailbreak in Philippine martial law history. And I can tell you that it's one of the most fascinating experiences a person can have. And for more than 7 years, I was successful in eluding the Philippine military until I got arrested in 1986 in the urban center of Cebu, which is the second largest city in the Philippines. That was the site of the maquilas. Before they had maquiladoras in Mexico, they had the maquiladora in the Philippines, in the island of Cebu, where multinational corporations can stay without any taxes whatsoever. And such was the place that labor unions and labor organizing was banned in these maquilas. That's why it was such a big issue. Anyway, because my presentation is limited to 10 minutes, I'll probably just say that after I was in prison and held without trial for almost 5 years, there was a campaign for my release, and I'm very thankful for Amnesty International because I became a priority case, being the only probably long-held political detainee without any trial. So a priority campaign was done in my, for my case, and I was able to get out of prison.
Wow.
When I was released from prison, I, as expected, became active in organizing again. It seems to me that I never learned any lesson with the more than 4 years of prison. But I was involved in the founding of Bayan. It is an acronym. The word Bayan means people or country in Tagalog. But it was also an acronym for the largest anti-dictatorship coalition in the Philippines called Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, New Anti-Imperialist Coalition. And at the time when we founded it, there was, given the presence of large organizations under the umbrella of Bayan, we had, I think, more than 1 million members throughout the country. Because we had the largest trade union organization, the largest women coalition, the largest coalition of tribal Filipinos, organizations of Muslim Filipinos, youth and student organizations, urban poor, and peasants. So it was a very powerful organization. And the single agenda that we have was to oust the dictatorship. I know that some of the questions that will be asked today is there a shortcut in terms of doing people power revolution? In terms of doing a non-violent people power revolution? I don't want to disappoint you, but the answer is there's no shortcut. It has to be a painstaking organizing. You have to always conduct the perpetual task of any activist, any organizer, which is arouse, organize, and mobilize. You don't give any let up. You keep on doing that work. It is not, and probably this is where I have some, divergence with what George Laker said, because in his manifesto on nonviolence, he presented stages of, consciousness raising, organization building, and then confrontation. In our case, it was not a stage. It was a perpetual task. You always have to raise consciousness. You always have to build organizations, the kind of grassroots organizations. And if there are grassroots organizations, you have to build on alliances. And even temporary kind of alliances with other political parties or political organizations that doesn't necessarily see with you eye to eye, but at least you see one target in particular, which was the dictatorship. And then mobilization. You always have to have mobilization. Especially in a context where martial law was declared and civil liberties were suspended, you always have to do mobilization. And the nature of your mobilization is one of confrontation. Because you can can never, go out and gather by yourselves, There was a presidential decree in the Philippines during martial law that 5 people who were, talking together in the streets was considered to be an illegal assembly, and you were liable for being arrested and put into prison. So every time we did an action, it was always to go to the point of George Lakey, confrontation. Confrontation doesn't necessarily mean violence. Confrontation is doing what you need to do, what is morally right, what is politically upright, but what is being prevented because the martial law and the civil liberties of people were suspended. It was in that process that finally, in 1986, we were able to do the non-violent people power revolution. As I said, it was this stage from a period when you cannot gather by yourself, if it was 5, it was people, it was illegal assembly. So we did it, we moved the barrier, so to speak, inch by inch, step by step. Where it was impossible, if they banned 5 people from coming, we came like 5 or 10, do a rally, what we described in the Philippines as lightning rally. Probably something that will last only for 2 to 3 minutes. And then disperse. And then come back again, gather, and prolong your presence in the street until it became a common sight, and the people themselves became so emboldened to participate in the action. And that was how the People Power Revolution in the Philippines, which, when it gathered in the street, it was not even in a matter of 2 hours, 3 hours program. It was a 24-hour event. And people came in, some people go home, take shower and food, come back and return until the revolution happened. There's, of course, a sad side to the revolution, and this is actually the main point that I want to communicate to each and every one of you. You see, the People Power Revolution in the Philippines was the poster child of the latest technological, development at the time, which was cable news TV. CNN just came out, and CNN was covering the People Power Revolution on a daily basis. In fact, the term People Power was not started by the Filipinos, but by CNN. And I personally was so mad about the term People Power, because it is like a unit of work. It is like horsepower or people power. It should be people's power, especially the power of the people to take into their own hands their destiny and to march towards the fulfillment of your agenda, which is national independence and real democracy in the country. Okay, I'm agitating now.
You got a couple more.
Okay. So anyway, CNN started that term, people power, and from then on, it was like the model that was followed by several countries. In China, they tried doing that at the Tiananmen Square incident. Of course, the kind of suppressions that they got from the government was so terrible. But it also happened elsewhere. In the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe, they started calling themselves People Power Revolution. In fact, they even attached colors to the revolution, because we also started that thing in the Philippines. We called our revolution the Yellow Revolution. And why it was yellow? Because, I don't know, it was around the assassination of Senator Aquino, who was on exile here in the United States. And when he returned to the Philippines, he was assassinated right there at the airport. That was the trigger for a lot of, resistance that took place in the Philippines. And since he was coming home, somebody thought that the, Tony Orlando in the Dawn song about tie yellow ribbon was so cool And so especially the middle classes in the Philippines, they started tying yellow ribbons, and then at the financial district in the Philippines, where the stockbrokers would join the protest by throwing yellow confettis, because they were cutting the yellow book and scattering all these pages as a sign of protest. They were called the Yellow Revolution. And then, of course, we have the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia or in the Czech Republic. There was the Orange Revolution in Georgia, or was it in Ukraine? I don't know now. But it became a model of so many revolutions. But to go back to my point, you know, there was an outside force that created it. The sad side of the revolution is that while we undid a Marcos dictatorship, it really never resolved the social issues in the Philippines. In fact, because there was a failure to bring to justice the military, who were the enforcers of the law during the martial law years, this military, who became so conscious of their political power, pretty soon, even under a civilian government of Corazon Aquino, was dictating their terms. During the Aquino regime, which lasted for 6 years, from 1986 to, I cannot compute at the moment, but 6 years, yes, there were like 7 coup attempts against Aquino. And the given was that the military remained unreformed. It was and then the point is that when this happened, especially the last coup attempt against Aquino, the U.S. actually became involved. They flew fighter planes in Manila to deter the coup, the coup plotters from initiating their action. But my point is, there was an external interference in what happened. And even the fact that CNN coined the first people power and so on and so forth, you know that there were an external force that was behind it. A force that was able to, shall we say, detract the movement from addressing the social issues. If you look at what is happening, or what has happened, or what has not happened in Egypt, remember what happened in the Philippines. Because in Egypt, they had the military intact. And there will be no genuine democracy, nor no genuine national freedom if that is the situation. And this is happening. If you look into Syria, why is that? That there is no support for the Syrian people struggled by the U.S. It is because of certain geopolitical interests that the U.S. wants to maintain in the Middle East. And the same thing in Bahrain, where the majority are Shiite, but then if the Shiite comes into power, it will be a problem for the U.S., especially because it is dealing with Iran. So my point is, there are external forces that are preventing people power from happening. And this will continue. There will be more people power revolution in the world. And my last point to end is that to say that for people power to happen as a serious historical initiative of the people, it needs to happen first here in the United States. Because if the U.S. continues in its practice of interference, of changing the agenda of the people, simply because there is no people power here that really gives substance, the meaning of what is for the people, and what is legal, political, economic, ideological, and spiritual power, then all the revolutions in the world will still be dictated upon by the United States. And I am imparting this important message to you because I am excited about what Occupy, Philadelphia, and so on and so forth is doing, but we need to come close more together and exchange experiences, because even within the movement, there are cleavages, there are natural barriers that prevent us from being a cohesive organization. And we need to have the discussion so that a real democratic revolution happen in the U.S. I'm not a U.S. citizen. And probably similar to Pompey, who was an English Quaker, who came to the U.S. and became active in the U.S. Revolution, in the English Revolution, in the French Revolution, and his bones are now missing because it got lost in the process transferring from the U.S. to Britain. But at least he had one single faith in the common sense pamphlet. He was so excited about it because not so much, in terms of seeking redress with Britain, but the idea of establishing and building your own nation. That's what was throbbing in the heart of the American Revolution. So I'm just saying that there is an extension of kind of anticipation for the role of the United States. We have to have a genuine people powers struggle here in the U.S. so that inference and the ability of the people all over the world to go forward to their own agenda will happen if there is no interference from this country. I think I exceeded 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Following that.
No, I will.
That is, as you can understand, why Val's kind of one of my heroes. Okay. Our next storyteller is Vivian Crawford. And I have to say, I had the chance first to meet her this evening, and I have a feeling we're going to get to know each other better over time from this point forward. Vivian's an attorney here in Philadelphia and identifies herself as a child of the civil rights movement. She was a part of the group that marched at Girard College with Cecil B. Moore to segregate it in 1965. She is counsel for the Philadelphia National Action Network here in Philadelphia, and she is a lifelong activist, as she is self-described, and I think we're all really honored that she's also agreed to come here this evening and share her story. Vivian. I probably need to.
I just need to. Oh, yeah. Let me see this one.
Okay, this is hot. All right, thank you.
Lucy, could you leave that down there, or that's where my mic is?
Oh, yes.
Just put it down there.
Okay. I said earlier when I was talking to Jody, she asked about my practice, and I said my practice is primarily, my focus is entertainment. So, that being said, you already know where I'm headed with this. No one wants to follow and act like I am having to follow. I would like to share with you something that I think is important. One of the reasons that I feel that we don't have the kind of activism that existed before was because, unfortunately, and you're going to think this is strange when I say it, we no longer have the overt racism that existed during the time that I came along and got into the movement. What do I mean by that? Simply that it was feasible for the civil rights movement to happen because there was a unity among people. There were people that looked at what was happening in this country to people of color and said, once this was brought to their attention, they said that there is something very wrong here. Now it's not as overt, it is hidden. Jody and I were talking about the fact that the prison has become a big business now, and education. We've got a governor that decides to increase prisons and money to prisons and let private corporations operate prisons, but education is not really important. Well, we all know that means that they're actually manufacturing bodies to go into these prisons, and so you have a lot of communities that lost their industrial interests, and now the industrial interest of a town that holds a town together is what? Prisons. So I come to this with that backdrop because what I realized as a kid, and I will tell you how I became involved in the civil rights movement, was that I got a call from a friend, and there was this movement. There was going to be a march in Washington, and there were going to be buses going down to Washington, and there was a very popular radio personality, and he said, well, you just call this number and we'll see about getting you on the bus to go to march on Washington. So that was the beginning, but how did that march happen? And who sponsored the buses that went from Philadelphia? The people that sponsored the buses that went from Philadelphia were the business people, because they realized what the problem was. The point at which the civil rights movement got to where they were not wanting to join with other communities is what I think caused the problem for me. Because I remember, and I'll give you some names, and perhaps you'll be familiar with who I'm talking about, but I remember as a kid that there were stores that operated up and down what was called Columbia Avenue, 52nd Street, and there were merchants. And the merchants primarily were Jewish merchants. And so they actually sponsored and they contributed money for the buses to go to Washington. So you had people like Bob Klein, who at that time owned WDAS radio. You had Harold Tregoop, who was in the furniture business on Lancaster Avenue. You had a group of people who said, let's come together because this is the right thing to do. It's no accident that there was a deliberate attempt to keep black people from interacting with the Jewish people who had been their neighbors, with Catholics who had been a part of the movement. All of a sudden, these people were splintered and separated because they had different interests. And that exists to this day. So I think that in order for a movement to be successful, it has to be inclusive. And we have to get to the point that we recognize that all we are doing in fighting with each other is allowing this corporate structure to perpetuate itself, and we don't get anywhere. So, as I said, I went to Washington, and it was interesting for me because I couldn't just believe the numbers of people that I saw there and the things that I heard. And because I was a kid, my father sort of entrusted us, because Cecil was a good friend of his, so he entrusted our care to Cecil to go to this march. So I was close enough to hear things. And I will never forget Martin Luther King speaking, and he was talking about economy and things that need to happen with jobs, and it wasn't really getting the crowd. And I heard someone, and to this day, I think it might have been Mahalia Jackson, I'm not sure, but it was a female voice saying, Martin, tell him about the dream. Tell him about the dream. And so that is when he launched, and that was not his prepared speech, and he launched into something about the dream, which of course now everybody knows that speech. If there is anything that I can share with you that is of particular interest is that, I don't know if any of you remember Trailways buses. During that time, African American people traveled on the buses. They went from point A to point B by bus. They didn't really ride trains, and actually transporting yourself by car was rather dangerous if you were going to the South. So that at the Trailways bus terminal, the only time you saw an African American person was that person was a janitor. They had a stand that sold hot dogs. There was nobody black selling hot dogs. There was nobody black selling tickets. There was nobody black fixing buses. All that they were janitors. So that Cecil, who was somebody that I had this wild, I was just so enchanted with Cecil. And so Cecil said, we're going to have a demonstration at Trailways. And it was right around Christmas time because, remember, black people traveled by bus, and so those people that were going to be going home to the South for Christmas would be traveling by bus. And what was strategic about it is that Trailways happened to be the hub for, Philadelphia happened to be the hub for Trailways. So that meant that if you were connecting to go down south, your hub was here in Philadelphia. So we were out there, and it was a snowy day, and we were out there, and we were just marching, and we're singing, "We shall overcome," and we're carrying our signs, and the buses are going in and out, and nobody's paying any attention to us, other than, oh, well, look at them, they're just out there marching. And so Cecil said, and if anyone in this room knew Cecil, you would know his sense of humor and the way that he talked, and he was a former MP, he was a military police officer, so he was very authoritarian. And he said, lay down in front of them buses. Ain't none of these crackers going to run over no little... We didn't even stop to think. Okay. And we laid down in front of the buses, and that is what stopped the buses from going in and out. And that's what brought Trailways to the table to negotiate. Wow. And Greyhound said, you don't have to do that to us. we want to talk. So now, you can see that you have that sort of mind that says you have to hit corporate America in their pocketbook. I'm so pleased with the occupiers. I just applaud them, because the reality is when you start hitting these interests in the pocketbook, that is when you get something done. And the beautiful thing about what the kids have done is that they say, well, who do we talk to? Who's the leader? Well, we don't have a okay. No, there's no one that you can compromise and bring to the table and sell us out. I think that's fabulous. So that what would I ask you to take from this? One of the things that we were taught about nonviolence, when we were out there marching and when we marched at Girard, there were the John Birchers. I mean, I don't hear people talk about the John Birch Society anymore, but they were a very real threat. And we would be out there marching and they would show up and they would counter-protest. And our instructions were never to make eye contact and never to speak. They were directed to who it was that spoke for us, but they could not talk to us individually. So they were never able to trap us into any sort of semantics. And I think now what I would like you to take away from this is what you have is with the internet, it makes it a lot easier. Now, there's another project that I have passion for, and it's a radio project, because I maintain that the civil rights movement of the 60s could not have happened if you had not had radio. Because we were all so used to tuning into WDAS and WHAT and people like, what was Dolly's name? Did anybody remember who I'm saying? Dolly Banks? Was that her? Anyway. If you didn't have people like that owned those stations who realized that it was really important to allow communication to happen so that when Martin Luther King traveled, remember there's no internet. When he was traveling around from city to city, he was traveling with very limited resources. I mean, there is Gwen Alexander, who is affiliated. I think Bob Klein was her dad. And she has done a wonderful job on the internet of putting together some historical facts about black radio. I am involved in a project because I think we need to start to honor these pioneers from black radio who actually kept the message going. So you knew where the demonstrations were because it was on the radio. And everybody was listening to the radio. And then we had fabulous music. And our music began to take on the color of what was going on in the movement. So I'd like you to take from this, you've got the internet, you've got access to communicating and tweeting and all of the various things that young people do, and that allows you to do something that Val's talking about, and that's to communicate. So you're able to do that, and I think that what you also have going for you is that you get it. It's about dollars. The only reason that people don't have the kind of freedom that you want is because it doesn't help corporate interests in this country. And so the moment that you start looking at corporate interests and saying, okay, we are prepared to reevaluate, let's restructure, let's rethink about how things happen. That's how movements happen. That's how you get passion going, because young people haven't bought in and they have not been compromised by the I don't want to say values. They've not been compromised by the materialism that happens when you get to be a certain age. And what you will find is that once you become a part of this movement, it lives in you. I cannot help myself. There's always going to be a cause. There's always going to be a something else, because that's who I am and that's what I do. And I want to, more than anything else, I'm here to sort of give you some information about how we did it. But I am so proud of you. I so much want you to understand that there are those of us who recognize that you get it. You get that as long as we buy into, and as long as you buy into, of the commercialism that has attacked this country, we're never going to get anywhere. But it can happen because you have just let young people see what the power is. All of a sudden, people now get that they have power. So from that, I mean, I'm here to speak to you, but there's so much I have learned from you. And I'm going to be around to answer questions, and hopefully that's some information. Thank you. Thank
you. Wow. Our next speaker, I'm going to wow more, is Rabbi Arthur Waskow, which I think probably most of the folks in this room are familiar with. Yes. And Arthur is a lifelong, also another lifelong movement activist who was a part of the anti-war, anti-racism D.C. delegation to the Democratic National Convention in 64 and 68, I believe. And has also written, how many here have read Arthur's writing? I'll probably, yes, lots of hands. Arthur has written The Freedom Seder. He works on, what I'm really excited about, he's also doing Eco-Judaism through the Green Menorah, which I'm really excited about, the Shalom Center, as the work of late. He's the author of Down to Earth Judaism, Trees, Earth, and Torah, Atubat, Anthology, Torah of the Earth, 4,000 Years of Ecology and Jewish Thought. He is a member of the Stewardship Committee of the Green Chevra, and we are really, really honored that Arthur is here. Arthur's requested to give his presentation sitting down. I think we will be more than happy to indulge him in such. Arthur Waskow.
Thank you. Mic check. Mic check. Shalom. Shalom. Salam. Salam. Namaste. Namaste. Shanti. Shanti. Peace. Peace. Now, why did I do that? In fact, I would say that was a piece of the consciousness-raising aspect of an ongoing direct action movement. I did it because I do it not only in a room where my hunch is there are probably Jews, Christians, Muslims, probably Buddhists, maybe Hindus, but I do it wherever I speak, even if it looks like they're probably all Jews in the room or all Muslims in the room. I've occasionally been invited to speak to a Muslim conference, or all Christians in the room. And I do it because I don't think there is any such thing anymore in the world as a room that has only Jews, or only Christians, or only Muslims, or only Buddhists in it. The earth is too intertwined. Our world is too intertwined for us to think that any one community sits alone in any room. And that's why I do it, to remind us, to remind me, and all of us. So I was trying to think about what in my wife says as many arrests as books, and that's about 21 or 22. What in them was part of a strategic process? Because a lot of them, I know, seemed pretty ad hoc. There was a moment when it seemed right to do a direct action that was likely to, and often did, result in getting arrested. But I realized that, in fact, many of what seemed like ad hoc moments were part of a 4-year, a 6-year, a 10-year process, a strategic process, and really hard to disentangle how to deal with that. So one way I thought of was there were several major strands. One was the strand of the southern and to some extent northern movement for ending segregation and possibly trying to end racism in the United States. Another was the movement against the Vietnam War. And since we've heard more about, and I think more not only tonight, but in general, about the civil rights movement, I think I'd like to talk about my experience in the other one. They were often, by the way, intertwined. By the late 60s, people were involved in both. When Dr. King, in 1968, exactly 1 year before he was killed, on April the 4th, 1967, at Riverside Church, addressed clergy and laity concerned about Vietnam and spoke out in a most vigorous public way against the Vietnam War, and more than against the Vietnam War, against, as he said, the triplets endangering American society: racism, militarism, and materialism. He already was part of an intertwining of the movements. Already, leaders of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, had been chanting, "Hell no, we won't go," about the draft for the Vietnam War, already before Dr. King did that. And many of the people who worked in the civil rights movement and were gaining victory by victory by victory as the Lyndon Johnson administration moved in those directions were criticized by some of their comrades in the civil rights movement for daring to oppose the Vietnam War, which was clearly going to infuriate the president who had so far been their ally. And Dr. King and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and others refused to knuckle under to that criticism. I've ended up thinking that when we talk about the prophetic vision and voice, there's one aspect of that that I think Quakers have made famous: speak truth to power. But there are two others that are really important. One is speak truth to the powerless. And the third is speak truth to your own supporters when they tell you to shut up. So, by late 1961, some of us in Washington had realized that the new Kennedy administration was moving in the direction of more and more U.S. troops into Indochina, into Laos, and into Vietnam. And we began, at first fairly quietly, to organize. By late 1964, after Lyndon Johnson escalated the war, the alleged attack on an American ship in a bay off Vietnam, which turns out to have been a lie, really a lie, the anti-war movement became far more public. And I remember being invited, more or less as a kind of engaged academic, sort of. I was at the Institute for Policy Studies, to speak at a Model UN conference in North Carolina in the role of the Secretary General of the UN addressing the General Assembly. And I was supposed to talk about something, I don't remember what, and I did what I was supposed to do until about 6 minutes before the end of my time. And then I said, okay, fine, I played the role. I'm not going to play the role now. If I were Secretary General of the UN, I might say this, or I might not be able to, but I am going to tell you as an American that the escalation of the war in Vietnam is a disaster. It arises out of an American arrogance that is going to ruin us, and we need to oppose it. And 1/3 of that college audience cheered and stood with a standing ovation, and 1/3 of them booed me, and 1/3 of them just sat there as if somebody had hit them over the head, which I guess is what they felt had happened to them. As a result of that talk, I got invited in May of 1965 to speak at what turned out to be the first teach-in at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. There had been an effort to call a student strike at Michigan, and faculty who were on the left and who opposed the war said, don't do that, don't do that. Don't do a strike. Instead, let's stay awake all night and learn what the story is and involve thousands of the students, not in going out to bars during a strike, but involve thousands of students in actually learning what the story is about Vietnam and challenging the university in a kind of off-balance way, not head-on, shut them down, but instead reinventing what a university was about through the night. So I actually, that weekend, had a choice because the great second Selma March was happening at the same time. And I decided every liberal in America was going to Selma, and it wasn't necessary, but this really needed some nurturing new. So I went. And I think I was the second speaker, and I talked about the new American arrogance. But in the middle of my talk, there was a bomb threat. And we were told we had to evacuate the building. So there was about 1.5 feet of snow at Ann Arbor at that point, but we went out into the snow. I remember some fraternities were marching with signs saying, nuke Hanoi. And we were talking about ending the war, bringing the troops home, and talking about what actually had been going on in Vietnam in detail. The result was that all over the country there flowered teach-in events. Universities everywhere thought that really made sense. And notice this was a kind of almost civil disobedience, but not quite, right? It was direct action that was not likely to bring about an arrest, but was a challenge to the whole structure of what a university was and wasn't. Because we were learning, but we were learning stuff that didn't fit in any university structure. The movement grew partly as a result of those teach-ins and as a result of more and more sense of horror at what was going on in the country. And by 1967, I was part of a small group that wrote and published a statement called A Call to Resist Illegitimate Authority. It was in support of those young men who were obligated by the draft to take part in the war and who were refusing. They were resisting illegitimate authority. And that statement went all over the country and supported young men, and then women who supported them. Women weren't being drafted, were barely in the armed forces at all at that point. So there was a wave of resistance to the draft as an aspect of resistance to the war. And one of the results of that was the indictment of Dr. Benjamin Spock, who was essentially America's grandfather. I mean, he had written all these baby-raising books, which most of the country used to raise their kids. So it was stunning that he was indicted by the federal government under Lyndon Johnson for conspiring to aid and abet resistance to the draft. And along with him, Bill Coffin, who had been the chaplain at Yale University, along with them, my friend and colleague, Marcus Raskin, a young Unitarian named Michael Ferber, a poet whose name doesn't come back to me right now. And they were indicted in federal court in Boston, where they hadn't done, there wasn't much reason to use Boston, except they thought they could get a federal judge who would be hostile to the defendants, and they did in the Massachusetts of that day. And there was a whole series of direct actions around the trial, including, again, not exactly arrestable direct action, but on the verge of it by the defendants themselves in court. Not as radical and confrontational as what happened in the Chicago trials several years later, but on the edges of that. Interesting side story. My friend Mark Raskin was charged in the indictment with doing stuff that he didn't in fact do. I did. And we did this stuff, or I did it, he was there, but not doing exactly the same thing. Inside the Department of Justice, bringing 1,000 draft cards that people had turned in, it was supposedly illegal to not carry your draft card. And we brought 1,000 of them that people had turned in, refusing to carry. We brought them to the Assistant Attorney General of the United States and put them in, the indictment said, a fabricoid briefcase, whatever that is, on the desk of the Assistant Attorney General. And we told them what it was, and we said, this is for you to take and deal with. And he said, I'm not touching that. And then this is what Mark was accused of, but I did. I pounded the briefcase and said, you say it's a crime not to carry your draft card. Here's the evidence of 1,000 criminals, and you, sworn to uphold the law of the United States, are refusing to take the evidence? Shame on you! Somehow, the FBI, which was recording what was going on, got mixed up between him and me, even though I had a beard and Mark did not. So that was a direct act of resistance. Those of us who turned in the cards were ordered to report to our draft boards because the FBI ended up sending the cards back to each draft board. And I was ordered by my draft board in Baltimore, where I hadn't lived for about 20 years, to appear because they had reclassified me 1A. I had been 4F for 20 years. 4F meant physically, not. That's a story in itself. But so I went, and I invited to go with me a reporter from the then Washington Star newspaper, the other one beside the Washington Post, and he did. And when we entered the room of the draft board, they said he couldn't come. And I said, why? And they said, well, it's private for the protection of the person who's being grilled by the draft board. I said, I'm the person. I would like him to come. They said, no reporters allowed. So we go in, and they say, tell me, we will forget about the reclassification if you'll agree to carry your draft card. And they had it there in front of them, right? I said, well, I'd like to make a statement. They said, no, you got to answer the question. Will you agree to carry your draft card? And then this can be all ended. I said, I'll answer your question as part of my statement. They said, no statements allowed. I remembered that I had in my briefcase a tape recorder. So I took the tape recorder out and I put it on the table and I pushed the button and I said, if you won't let me make the statement, then the tape recorder is going to tape you refusing and me insisting on making the statement. And they said, you're not allowed to tape record. I said, who says? Where does it say? They all looked stunned. Then they said the secretary, the only woman in the room, they ordered her to go find the regulation that said you couldn't do it. Meanwhile, I'm looking at my tape recorder and I realize the microphone's not attached. It's spinning around like a gun with blanks. And I rummage in my briefcase and I don't have the microphone. But they don't know. So the poor secretary comes back and says, I can't find the regulation that says they can't record it. So I said, look, if you will let me take the statement, I will turn off the tape. Okay. So I said, well, my statement's this. This war is illegal. It's immoral. It's unjust. It's disgusting. Why don't you resign from being on the draft board? They said, will you carry your draft board? I said, I made my statement. Will you resign? So they ushered me out. And they delayed and delayed until I was too old to be drafted, even if I was 1A. And so that ended. But then I was at that point refusing to pay the telephone tax, which the Congress had put on precisely to pay for the Vietnam War. And the telephone company didn't care. If you every month paid your regular bill and attached a little note saying, refusing to pay the tax because it's part of the Vietnam War, they informed the government, but they didn't turn off your telephone. So I did this for months and months and months. It was only about, 90 cents each time, something like that. And then I got a call from the IRS. We understand you're not paying the tax on your telephone. I said, that's true. They said, well, we need to have a conversation. I said, okay, good. Why don't you come where I work at the Institute for Policy Studies, this progressive think tank, right? And they said, you want us to go where you work? Because nobody ever wanted the IRS to come where they work. That was going to shame somebody. I mean, terrible, guilty. So I said, yeah, that's fine. So They said, okay, we made a date. And then I sent the memo around the Institute saying we're going to have a seminar on the ethics of tax return. And the seminar is going to have 2 guys from the IRS. So about 35 people show up. These 2 guys are totally stunned. There was a good cop and a bad cop, right? The good cop was a young black guy, and he kept saying, I understand how you feel about the war. I don't like it myself. But you can't just stop paying the tax. You got to convince Congress by legal democratic means. You got to convince Congress to stop the war. The other guy, the bad cop, was an ex-Marine. He said, oh, this is absolute nonsense. You're not allowed to do stuff like this. You got to pay the tax. And presumably between them, like good cop, bad cop, I was going to cave in. But I had 30 people in the room who were fascinated by this. All right, so I told it's about time to stop. What I think I want to communicate to you is there was a constant process. Each of these seemed to be, you might say, on its own. I didn't pay the telephone tax, direct, right, nonviolent resistance. So it resulted in this very peculiar consciousness-raising event. And I could keep going on. 1968, 1969, and the sense that there was in fact joy, humor, funniness, ridiculousness, absurdity in this process, and that I could feel revived and given new life. I wasn't just being hammered by the state, but we were turning it inside out, and we were able to ridicule this arrogance and this overwhelming power. And what I think I want to say, one of the things I want to say, is that part of being able to carry on against the machine, the 1%, is being able to infuse your resistance with laughter.
I agree. The final panelist for this evening is Cindy Milstein, who is a part of Occupy Philadelphia. Cindy is at the Institute for Anarchist Study board member and an active participant in Occupy Philly. She has been involved in numerous anti-capitalist efforts, collective spaces, and popular education projects, such as co-organizing the upcoming Occupy from Below, Resist, Reflect, Recreate tract at the Left Forum in New York. She is the author of Anarchism and Its Aspirations and the forthcoming collective book, Paths Toward Utopia, Explorations in Everyday Anarchism. And I am delighted that you are on this panel. And do you want to just...
I'm going to stand up.
And she's going to stand up. Great. And here you go.
If everybody else wants to stand up for a minute and shake out, because I feel like we're going to while they're sitting like that.
You don't mind there?
Do I have to get this close? Okay. So I'm the last story, and then I think we're doing Q&A and breaking into small groups for conversations. Hopefully that'll be appreciated. I've been so enjoying the stories, I can't believe I have to talk now. So, but I really wanted. I feel like the power of what. I'm an anti-capitalist, and one thing I hate about capitalism is it destroys the whole world, including memory and historical memory and memory of movements, by like writing off anything that keeps the power of people. And so I've been really appreciating stories, really, really powerful ways for us to take back our world again. Okay. So I actually wanted to talk about, focus on diversity of tactics as a strategy toward a goal that allows for a whole bunch of tactics. And look at that concept through the lens of two large mobilizations which looked sort of like the Occupy movement in a lot of its parameters, and really is sort of the precursors and why we see Occupy being, I think, part of the same lineage of mass mobilizations that involved direct democracy, a lot of self-organization, from street medics to food, to carnivals, to all sorts of things that people self-organize themselves in moments when people took the twofold meaning of direct action, which I understand to be, one is stopping things we don't like ourselves, like putting ourselves, there were some great examples of that, but the other part of direct action that I actually love more and think is more powerful is when we just decide to do things the way we want to see them done without looking to other people to do them. We directly do the world ourselves in the way we want, which to me is the revolutionary, the beginning of the process of what revolution looks like. So that's why I want to focus on diversity of tactics, because I feel like it is part of this move toward us reclaiming space to make the world we want. And I actually want to step back a little. A lot of this conversation has been about strategy, and to me that actually, the kind of missing thing in there is strategy for what? So I always like, for me it's more important to think about what's our goal, our aspirations, our ideals, what do we want to see? And that might look really different for all of us, but I want to talk about two moments where there were people who framed it around a specific goal, and then had a strategy to get there, and used different tactics. And I feel like part of the Occupy movement, I would hope we would move toward more sort of, what is our goals in very transparent ways. So the first moment is where the phrase diversity of tactics came from. It was, I'm pretty sure it was probably I'm pretty sure I know exactly the person who wrote it, but it was a small group of anarchists in Montreal who at the height of what's known as the, people call it the anti-globalization movement, or the alter-globalization, or the counter-globalization movement. But the movement in North America that we understand sort of starting with Seattle in 1999, which David Solnit, I think, was speaking to 2 times ago. And Canadian anti-authoritarians and anarchists, I think, are like 20 million times smarter than we are here in the United States. And so they saw some of the problems about some of the mass mobilizations happening is that people needed more of a basis of unity. So they came up with exactly that, hammered it out in directly democratic ways. And the group in Montreal called themselves CLAC, which is French, but it stood for Anti-Capitalist Convergence. And the basis of unity was something they came through directly democratic processes like we do in General Assembly over a long time period. And I won't go through all the details, but some of it was in opposition to capitalism, neoliberalism, anti-imperialism, and a host of other isms that we don't, racism, patriarchy. But the interesting part of this basis of unity, I think, also, was that it called for autonomous, decentralized, and non-hierarchical forms of organization, a confrontational attitude that rejects reformist alternatives to the structures we're opposing. So, the sort of linchpin of this basis of unity was the diversity of tactics phrase, which was, quote, the use of a variety of creative initiatives ranging from public education campaigns to direct action. And they understood this as doing a bunch of things. Number one, it was a goal in itself. Our goal is to create a society that is autonomous, decentralized, non-hierarchical, without exploitation, forms of domination, and the other things that they had listed that they didn't like. But to do that, that meant creating coexistence of people who don't all agree with each other. What does unity of diversity look like? How does it look like I always like the idea of, an orchestra where you have all sorts of different instruments, but there's something that comes together that sounds beautiful, but we wouldn't tell all the instruments to play the same way or it wouldn't work. So there's same way as the goal is a society that allows for a diversity of human beings living a diversity of ways, as long as they're not exploiting, hurting, endangering each other, and everybody has enough of what they want and desire. So it itself was a goal, and it became a strategy to how to do these mass mobilizations. So the way they understood why it was important was not as anything goes, anyone can do whatever they want, but precisely the opposite. That it opened up space for everybody to understand themselves in that diversity. It allowed for a specific framework that everyone had come to and agreed to. So now we can actually have conversations about what different strategies would work to get at what we want together that would actually work in harmony with each other, be in solidarity, help us have each other's backs in better ways, and keep everybody safer in the different ways we understood that, while also being able to do different sort of confrontational activities. Okay, so I just wanted to touch on then two specific moments in this. One was in 2001 in Quebec City, which is where really one of the most interesting I was at. It was incredible. I thought revolution was first time in my life. I thought, oh, in North America we might actually see revolution. And maybe it will take a little longer, which I appreciate. It takes a long time. But they used this throughout the form of this mobilization, which was to contest the Summit of the Americas, which was meeting there. There's a castle, basically, structure in the middle of Quebec City. And so they framed this convergence against capitalism as attacking the fortress, which had become this castle, which was literally ringed with fences of police to protect the world leaders who were deciding the fate of billions and billions of people. And what was beautiful about the diversity of tactics, I'll just use one example, was they spent a long time hammering out very explicitly that there would be red, yellow, and green zones. Now, the police didn't necessarily respect those zones, but the idea was we would have an agreement that people could then pick the level of which they felt. So in the yellow zone, green zone, which was safer zone, there was this big space under an overpass, which there was food that we all made together and a lot of bands, and you could hang out, and it was a space where nothing, people were not going to try to draw the police into. There was childcare, et cetera, et cetera. It was a space where you could come to, chill out and relax and, in theory, get away from police during the mass mobilization. The red zone was going to directly go up and confront the fence that was standing in front of the fortress. And then within that red zone, which we spent, I think, a 5-mile walk to get there one day, thousands and thousands of people walking to get up there, they had constructed this giant catapult, because the fort did look very medieval. And so the catapult, if you stood behind the catapult, you definitely wanted to be confrontational, but a little less confrontational. And if you stood in front of the catapult, you really wanted to be confrontational, meaning the goal was to tear that fence down, which that day symbolically was to open the fort, to tear down the fortress, to make the space ours, just symbolically. Right? And what was beautiful about the catapult was it was flinging, it got toward the fence, and it started flinging teddy bears over it. It was anarchists who were at the catapult, who had made the catapult, and one of them was very, very articulate, and he kept getting in the media all the time, and actually ended up getting, wouldn't be let into the United States, later seen as a terrorist because he was throwing teddy bears over the fence at police. The police, in turn, catapulted tear gas canisters back across at us. So the people in front of the catapult had big buckets, and they caught the tear gas canisters, had really thick gloves, and threw them back at the police, who were extremely well protected from tear gas, unlike the many thousands of us who weren't. So it was a very, the medics were running around, all of us got tear gassed, even if you felt like you were behind the catapult, But then there were people who stayed in the green zone, which was quite a distance away and didn't have to experience tear gas. And then we all reconvened after hours and hours of trying to rip the fence down and battling tear gas and running through the streets and everybody feeling really good because we created this space that felt safe in the way everybody wanted to, but really confrontational. We had a big, wonderful celebration together later at the end of the day. So it's just an interesting moment where people together can figure out a strategy that makes sense at a specific moment. Obviously, capitalism's still here. Didn't work. All right. So the other thing I want to just talk about for about 5 minutes or so, and then I'll wrap up, is something using Canadian examples because they're the ones that brought diversity of tactics into our language of mobilizations. And in 2010, I went to this mobilization too. It was in Vancouver, and it was called No Olympics on Stolen Native Land. They spent also about a year and a half through directly democratic assemblies, agreements. They had thousands of people organizing this. At one point, they were also mad at each other. They had 3 people in the room, and then they said, nope, we're going to keep doing this. I actually didn't understand why you would want to oppose the Olympics so much until I went to Vancouver, and then I understood that what happened was, for the 2 years leading up to that, were trying to build all these luxury condos, literally on stolen native lands, and so there'd been massive amounts of indigenous folks standing in front of bulldozers, doing a lot of direct action to stop those kinds of building projects. They'd taken queer youth centers and given them to the transgendered or queer athletes, and displaced really poor kids in Quebec City who were queer, who didn't have a place to go. That's just the tip, again and again, in all sorts of ways, it affected everybody. So what was really beautiful about this moment was the diversity of tactics strategy, which again they agreed to as a framework, brought people that were indigenous. There's a lot of East Indians in Vancouver, poor and homeless, many of whom are women and many of whom are indigenous women in Vancouver. Non-documented, there's a huge non-documented groups of people and immigrants, all doing really good work under something called Known as Illegal. Anarchists and a whole bunch of other people to these directly democratic assemblies to figure out what it would look like to do something under this goal called No Olympics on Stolen Native Lands. And what was beautiful about that phrase was it also got at the idea that capitalism has stolen the entire world from us in every way. So, everything, when I got to Vancouver, everything had been really stolen by the capitalistic display of Olympics. And people were really great. They're like, we love sports. This isn't against sports. It's against the commodification of sports. I was even one night with a bunch of local people who really want to go to the games, and they're like, none of us can go because the tickets are $500 each. So even if you wanted to participate in the Olympics, it wasn't something for the community. So the two things that I think were really big, this was one of the most moving week-long or so demonstrations I've ever been at. Every day they had 2 or 3 things going on. But what they did over a year was hammer out what would happen on those 7 days of the Olympics, where each group that had come to the table would get to create the theme and the focus of each day, and other people, because of a diversity of tactics, would agree to be in solidarity and back up what was happening. So I just wanted to point to 2 of these days which were really, really remarkable, because you could tell the work that went into this to allow people to be on the streets, to have each other's backs in the way, to let people do things they wanted to do in different ways that were really powerful. One was the first day that the Olympics was set to open. There was going to be this grand multi-billion-dollar ceremony in the center of Vancouver that was revolving around glorifying indigenous people. A few of the indigenous nations had signed on to this. Most of the indigenous nations were really upset about this, but it was like, oh, look, all the indigenous people are really excited about the Olympics, when actually it probably impacted indigenous people more than anyone in Vancouver. So the indigenous folks wanted to lead a long march that night called Take Back Our City. And they asked the Known as Illegal people, who were, again, there was thousands of us there. There was thousands of indigenous people in the center walking. On one side, there was a huge contingent of Known as Illegal, most of whom are East Indian. And on the other side were thousands of anarchists, some of whom were, dressed up in all black, others of whom were just dressed up like people. But it was really clear they were anarchists from their banners. It was really clear the indigenous people, and it was really clear who the Known as Illegal were. And thousands of us walked this march to where this thing was happening, and we come literally this close to a line of police. The indigenous folks are this close to a line of police. And it was called family friendly, so we stood there, and it was getting more and more tense because the police were not happy we were there, and the indigenous people were getting more and more upset because they knew inside there was this really horrible spectacle using them to make the Olympics seem wonderful. And they stood up and they gave speech after speech after speech saying we wouldn't be able to be here right now and be okay standing nose to nose with the police if it wasn't for the anarchists who'd made this safe feel comfortable for us, if it wasn't for the Known as Illegal people who made it feel comfortable for us. On each side of us, they're holding us to be able to walk to this space. And we created this as a family-friendly space. We asked nobody to be confrontational. We asked that we would stop here. And we did that for about an hour. And then they said, and we want to just thank especially the anarchists for being willing to go along with this after us figuring out this. So we are now going to walk backwards for a block, which we hadn't planned to do. And when we're gone, we're going to say, now, and you guys can do whatever you want. And that wasn't actually planned. And it was this beautiful moment where everybody was so stunned that I was actually doing media, but I was on the side of the anarchist block. And it was really nice because the anarchist block actually encircled the indigenous folks, many of whom were quite elderly, and made sure they could get away safely because there was lots of police and it was scary. And then the anarchists went back and stood nose to nose with the police and basically took their hats off and put them on their heads, which is about pretty much what happened. Someone threw a plastic bin over, the police threw it back, they had riot gear on, and that was the end of it. But what was interesting about it was just this moment of a sense of people being in and trusting each other, being able to do something together, and allowing for something spontaneous. The second part of this, and then I'll end, was 2 or 3 days later, there was what was meant to be anarchists using the strategy of a black bloc masking up so people can't tell who you look like, which is the only purpose of it. If it's a tactic to evade police strategy, it's not an identity, it's not an organization. And they had to call this day the heart attack, that capitalism is destroying us, it's giving us a heart attack. And they had planned to walk about 3 miles to blockade where the Olympics were supposed to go up to the mountains to start that day. And they went, I was again doing media, so I was walking down the street, and what was amazing was there were all these folks who were liberal NGOs who had been part of the organizing who decided to mask up and walk in the block. So it actually wasn't, because they had gained such trust, they're like, we're mad about this. We actually want to be a little more confrontational today and go actually blockade a street at the end of this. So we're walking down miles after miles, huge, even bigger police presence, of course, because it's anarchists. They always send more police. And so walking, we get to the downtown. There's about a mile-long strip of nothing but large, very fancy glass buildings. Glass, okay. And we're walking down the street, and the police kept trying to taunt us. They kept coming over and hitting with sticks and kind of, I was not... Again, I was doing media at this, but they were attacking my friend who was a journalist. They actually broke his camera. So they kept coming over and trying to attack us or provoke it. And everyone's like, no, we're disciplined. We have a mission. We're going 3 miles. We're going to shut down the Olympics. And all of a sudden we looked around and we saw a lot of the indigenous folks that had been marching the other day. And they were on the corners of all the streets telling us where the police were and trying to keep the police away from us and directing us so we could keep walking. And it was so moving. None of us had expected them to show up. But they kept going, we're here for you now because you were here for us the other day. And we walk down, and then we get in front of the Hudson Bay Company, and 1 or 2 people break the Hudson Bay window. And everybody who was there, indigenous folks, the liberal NGOs, and everyone was like, great, that's wonderful, let's keep going. Because the Hudson Bay Company had been the prime sponsor of the Olympics. The Hudson Bay Company had been the prime corporation decades ago, centuries ago, who'd come to Vancouver, that part of the territory which was indigenous land, and stolen native lands. So it was so symbolic to people that everybody was like, that was so perfect, that was so right, now let's just keep going. We're walking down the street. And we all ended up the street, and of course there were so many police we couldn't blockade, and they ended up arresting tons of us at the end. But again, I just wanted to point to, regardless of what you think is the correct tactic to use of confrontation, at certain moments, this idea that we can create space so people can do things that are symbolically important and pushing the edge of things and have each other's back. And what was most powerful at the Olympics for me was the first day when I got there was a scrappy anarchist convergent space with all these great, bands and stuff and free food and blah, blah, blah. And there were a lot of indigenous folks there, and one of them stood up and he goes, we've already won. We've already won because we had 3 goals when we started doing this. One was to put the Olympic organizers on the defensive. They're completely on the defensive because we've illuminated everything they're doing that's horrible, and people get that in our city, which again was true. And that was the second goal, was to illuminate all the ways they had stolen everything from everyone in Vancouver, and they really had done an incredible job in that. Every person on the street was in support of what was going on, even if they wanted to go to the Olympics, or not everyone, but a huge percentage of the city was behind this. And the last goal was we wanted to build relationships between people who don't usually have relationships in the city. Indigenous folks, anarchists, some of whom were East Indian, some of whom were indigenous, and homeless people, etc. We wanted to build solid relationships and be able to trust and be able to move forward as communities. And that was so clear. So toward the end of the week, I went to this dinner that had 600 people that was put on by indigenous folks, and I ended up being one of the few white people there at the end, and probably the only anarchist because a lot of people had left. And they all stood up and they said, we just have to thank the anarchists and the East Indians and the No One's Legal and the homeless people and everybody for seeing that we're all in the same fight together. And it was so moving to me because I felt like I was overhearing something that wasn't meant for me. But that, to me, was the beauty of why so my end of this is I hope we can think about whether we put it in paper or not, is trying to have a little bit more compassion and trust and building toward real relationships that allow us to see that the diversity of who we are and what we do and how we do that actually is going to make us a stronger movement and actually make us effective in getting rid of hierarchy, domination, exploitation, injustice.
Okay, so we're going to take it's a little after 8, and we're going to take about 15 minutes for question and answer. As a process for my question and answer, I would like, because we're going to do the small group where you're going to be able to share, I would really like your questions to be questions and not commentary at this point as much, because we're going to have that opportunity in small groups to kind of share what your own experiences about things. So I'm going to look for hands, and I'm going to stand up so I can do it, and then I'm going to hand the mic here so you guys can just pass it back. I'm going to go to this one so that we can do it. I am going to go from right to left, and I see here. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentations. Can you clarify, and I'm sorry, I've met you and I'm forgetting your first name, the last speaker.
Cindy.
Cindy, can you clarify, Cindy, when you say diversity of tactics, and you closed with the story of the broken windows, I would define violence as damage or destruction of persons for non-self-protective reasons. When you advocate for diversity of tactics, are you meaning to include violence if we define it in those terms?
Do I take them? I want to take them. I'm going to just take them.
Okay. Can you just say again what your definition was?
Yeah.
And please correct my definition if it's faulty,
I don't
but
even-
I would define violence as damage or destruction of persons for non-self-protective reasons. And so I would not define the breaking of those windows as violence, for example. And so I'm asking you, but you emphasize diversity of tactics, which I've heard in conversation along with violence and nonviolence. And so I want to ask very pointedly, if we did define violence that way, would you include it in advocating for diversity of tactics?
I actually want to start off with I find the start at point violence, nonviolence completely nonsensical because it is totally devoid of any context, any historical moment, any choices people make, who's doing the violence. I feel like, we don't include the police in that when we talk about movements always involve huge amounts of violence. Mostly it's the military and police against us, which doesn't include it. But I actually take that violence seriously. I want to end that violence. So, diversity of tactics is not meant as anything goes. That wasn't what, to me, what we need, in a sense, are binding promises to each other, whether we put those in writing or we come up with principles of unity that allow us to explicitly set parameters of trust so we can work out what that is. And anything on a piece of paper is meaningless. So I really want to emphasize what the diversity of tactics as written down was. It became a framework for people to say, our goal is how do we have a diverse society that can coexist, where people feel safe and have what they need and want and desire, and don't hurt and exploit each other. If that is how we want to do our politics to get there, this is my, politics, we need to prefigure the world we want to see. Then we need to sit down and hammer that out together for when we do distinct things here. So I just want to point to an example from Occupy Philly. There was Florence Mason's house, many of you know. People went into that house to help her clean out the house when she was thrown out of her house by the police, violently by the police. Actually, they physically touched people, hurt her dog. People had to do property destruction. When we do housing foreclosures to save them, we do property destruction. We break locks to get in the house. But that is not the first question. That's so uninteresting to me, is should we break locks? What's interesting is, do we want to help people by defending people who are being in foreclosed houses? Then we go, okay, that might involve someone having to break the lock, potentially, right? Is that someone willing to do that? That probably involves some of us staying on the street and not getting arrested so we can document it. It might mean someone can go there as a medic. So for me, again, what's more interesting is for us to get out of this silly nonviolent violence framework and say, what are the diverse things we need to do to make things we want to happen that have a goal, okay? And so a window to me is property destruction. If there's someone standing behind it and you're breaking it and going to hurt them, that's not a good thing, right? So that is
yeah.
I mean, in this case, it was literally a mannequin behind a window with a wall behind it. So there was no one who was going to get hurt by breaking that window.
I know, Arthur, you probably want to comment about this, but I'll do it quick, and then I'm going to go here, and then I'm going to go here. Go ahead.
So I would make the line a little different from whether breaking the window would hurt somebody physically or not. There are some, I think, forms of property destruction that are nonviolent. When people destroyed the draft records at, I can't remember which group it was, of the Berrigan Catholics, that destroyed draft records. The draft records were themselves violence. It doesn't seem to me that a window in front of a store is itself violence. A lock, maybe. The lock on a house that keeps out the person who's been living in the house, I think that's a violent piece of property. But I think if one then looks, quote, strategically that the tactic has some effects on the public. And I think people are capable of making a distinction between breaking the lock that keeps somebody from living in the house and breaking a window that is not itself intrinsically violent. So I would really make the question very different. I totally agree with you about the prefiguring. I think one of the brilliant things about the sit-in movement was it didn't go to the Congress to say, please pass a law. That ultimately happened. But it said, we think the restaurants should be racially integrated. So we're going to racially integrate them, then they'll have to figure out what to do with us. They can put us in jail, they can kill us, or they can say, okay. They ultimately, mostly said okay. I agree with you about that part. But then I think there certainly are these moments when you got to make fine distinctions. And I would say not attacking human beings, and in terms of property, what I said is the property itself intrinsically violent.
Okay, I'm going to go here.
Yeah, for anyone who chooses to take it.
So this question is for any of you.
Yeah. Should we not be focusing our first priority on an economic boycott of the news media? They are the ones who keep these vicious personalities in power. A change in tactics.
There's a mic over there. Does anybody want to answer that question? The question is, should we, as a priority, which boycott the news media? Focus on... So you're asking this entire group of people if they would like that to be their number one priority? Is that
right?
Okay. Anybody want to respond to that? Vivian does.
I guess I'm not sure if I understand the question, but I think that I did allude to earlier that the internet has leveled the playing field in terms of getting messages out. I don't think there's anyone in this room that for a moment thinks that corporate media is going to do anything other than advance the corporate structure.
Right.
So that by saying should we ban them, they're going to continue because their mission is not about news. Their mission is about protecting corporate structure. So I don't know if banning them solves anything other than I've always thought that it's important to communicate. I alluded to radio and how that helped the civil rights movement, and I think that we have to make the accessibility of the internet and that be the way that the message gets out more than expecting that corporate media is going to ever address our needs. I mean, it would be nonsensical for us to expect that from them.
Okay, I see a hand over here, then you. John?
This question is for Vivian and the rabbi. What are the differences between the strategies that you use in the civil rights movement and the strategies that we use as occupiers?
Well, it's really an intriguing question because the civil rights movement did, in a sense, occupy territory like restaurants, drugstores, buses, etc., etc. And all of our movements went into public space the Great March on Washington for jobs and freedom. People forget it was for jobs as well as freedom. That was also, and even John Kennedy, who people thought was sort of a liberal, especially after he was killed, they decided he was a liberal, was against the March on Washington. He was frightened of it, didn't want it to happen. When it became clear it was going to happen, he bent and bowed. But, okay, the notion and the permanent or semi-permanent occupation of public space, the first time I remember a big job like that was the Poor People's Campaign in the mall in Washington, where thousands of people stayed for weeks. And it goes back, the bonus march, the bonus expeditionary force after World War I. So it's not a totally new tactic at all. What was maybe new about this, that thing in '68, the Poor People's Campaign did a lot of it, was the deliberate attempt to create a new community in the space, to do the prefiguration of the free society, the beloved community, to do that in the space that was taken over. I think that was maybe the most new thing. And what we've realized is there is, in fact, enough quasi-military power in this society to break that. I've heard people talk about what does the Occupy movement do in diaspora. It's a really interesting use of that word, right? So if you lose the space that you think is your sacred space, what do you do having lost it? How do you create? The Jewish community in diaspora created its own miniature sacred spaces in order to preserve a sacred community. And I think the transition has begun in the Occupy movement toward doing that, but isn't fully fruitful yet.
Vivian?
Yes, I know. I'm just thinking, I'm sorry, I was so busy listening to what Rabbi was saying. How do I think it's different?
Yeah. What are the, I said, as far as tactics are concerned?
Well, I think that you ultimately have access to communication, and I think the fact that you are indeed you don't have a leader, and I keep going back to that because that challenges the structure.
Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
No, I think it's a great thing. I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about that. No, I think it's a great thing because there is not one focal point. This is a movement against something that is wrong, and we refuse to be identified with a personality. So what do I think is different? The civil rights movement was very much personality driven. There were those people that ascribed to Malcolm X. There were those people that followed Martin Luther King Jr. And within the movement, that the moderate movement, so to speak, there was always the difference. I don't know if anybody remembers Adam Clayton Powell, and I think Adam Clayton Powell was actually, it was wonderful for what it was that he was doing because he was operating within the structure. So when you ask how is it different, I think that it's not a culture of personality. And I think that one of the reasons that the civil rights movement lost a lot of its fervor is because they were very successful. Let's do away with the key spokesperson. Let's do away with the humanitarian. Let's do away with the soul of the movement, and therefore the movement people will scatter. So I think you're ahead of the game because you don't. It's not a cult. It's not a cult of personality.
Yes, my question is for anyone who wishes to answer.
Wait, Mike.
My question is for anyone who wishes to answer. It expands on the idea raised a few minutes ago about giving consequences to irresponsible journalists. Journalism is a code. It has a code of ethics. It's science. We, the taxpayers, support billion-a-year agencies that issue licenses that are required to broadcast, to publish. We own the licenses these people are using to hurt us, to deprive us of the truth, to manipulate us, while they stuff their back pockets with payments from those who wish to control them, and who are able to do that as long as they're lacking what's important in life and see money as their aim, their goal. So we can start a petition, or do you think we can start a petition that will recall the licenses of any journalist who is not practicing journalism according to the required codes? Thank you.
The question was for any of you. I think that I've heard this before. Where
Are we talking FCC?
Yeah, I think we're talking FCC.
I'm not sure that I understand how one affects if we're talking about doing away with licenses that belong to corporate entities that broadcast. I mean, are you suggesting that perhaps we all show up at an FCC meeting when a license is called into question to protest? I'm not.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, well, then I guess essentially that's the answer. if that's the road that you want to take, if indeed we're looking at fixed news. Fixed news is, I mean, but they seem to operate with impunity. But I don't know that as a tactic that we've ever thought about, at least from my standpoint with NAN, that we've ever really thought about challenging licenses. I think a while back we did talk about Glenn Beck, and were successful in bringing some pressure to bear on fixed news to sort of quiet him down. But in terms of actually showing up at the licensing event, I don't know that I've ever considered that, and I think maybe it is a good idea. I don't know.
Once upon a time, there was a thing called the Fairness Doctrine, in which radio and television had to provide a spectrum of opinions. In the first 3 months of the Obama administration, there was a panic among the talk show people, Rush Limbaugh and folks like him, that there was going to be an attempt to restore, which had gotten abolished, the Fairness Doctrine. But nobody in the Obama administration did diddly squat to restore the Fairness Doctrine. I think that's because we were not demanding that, we weren't demanding very much anyway of the first 3 months of the first year or 2 years of the Obama administration. But that was one of the things nobody was demanding. So the panic died down and they weren't disturbed. And only Glenn Beck, right now, Rush Limbaugh, only the most egregious, there have been pressures on the advertisers. But we should be thinking, I don't know what it would mean to talk about the code of journalism for these guys, but a notion of the Fairness Doctrine of a whole spectrum having to be represented, that makes total sense. And it used to make total sense, and it used to work.
I'm going to go here to 99. I saw you first, and then the woman was at Star, and then you, and then Greg. And if I'm missing other people, I'm really sorry.
Hi, I'm really glad everyone came out. Thank you so much. My question is for Val. What are you up to these days, and where do you see the struggles that you were involved with today? How are they still? How are they getting along, and where do you see yourself going in the future, or currently, for that matter?
Well, first, I'd like to say that right now I am unemployed. So, what is my concentration is basically to find work, and I hope that it is doing some kind of work allied to what I've been doing, in the last 19 years, which is being a paid organizer and a movement building person. But it is a process. I don't know how it will end, but it doesn't prevent me from doing other things. And so I very much participated in the dynamics that happened. Probably the financial situation, I had limited my ability of reach. Whereas before I could go to various conferences and meetings of United for Peace and Justice, of which I was, a member of the steering committee. Right now I'm very local. And I limit my expenses to $10 a week, which means 3 tokens. 6 tokens, which means 3 days. And that's how I actually divided my participation at the Occupy Philly movement when it was happening in October. I was very much interested in being a part of the dynamics because personally for me, seeing this thing unfold in the U.S., you can just imagine, how really inspired I was about what was taking place. I was hoping to participate and, give some ideas about my experience. And the entry point I was considering at the time, I don't know if Daryl is still here,
yes, he's
was actually, he was planning to do a caucus of people of color at the Occupy Philly, which I think is very important. Let me stand because I'm getting agitation here. Which is important because if we're able to do that kind of conversation within Occupy Philly, and probably some parallel at other conversations like the issue of citizens and residents and illegals. Because all of us are affected by this, and that is one of the key issues which probably can touch a lot of people, but unfortunately, given the social order that we have in the U.S., the illegals have difficulty participating. And if we look at the economic impact that these people, are going through right now, whereas people who have been working gets unemployed and can get unemployment, these people used to work for those people who are now unemployed. And I hope that there was a conversation in Occupy Philly for that. Because Occupy Philly, while it has, I really acknowledge the wonders that the young people are doing. There is no machinery to any movement, revolutionary or otherwise, except young people. They have to be there, and so I'm glad about that. But in that kind of dynamics, there has to be an interface with the various issues of oppressions happening here in the United States. And that's why I'm connecting the whole issue of racism and connecting the whole issue of immigration, of citizenship and non-citizenship, because in the final analysis, the resolutions of all these things that probably divides us will really build a strong movement here in the United States. And I am not underplaying the importance again of the movement I see here in the U.S. Somebody says there has to be the mother of all movements. I think it is here. Because if this is the power center that dictates the behavior and what is ever unfolding in our different countries in the world, then that's how essential the work is here. And I'm seeing the dynamics that are happening around Occupy. It is so energizing. And I hope that we will keep on energizing and energizing it. And then probably around tactics and the question before, I'd just like to add three things. At least based on my experience in the Philippines, which could be particularly for the Philippines. Number one, we're speaking about tactics. Probably I'm an old school person, but I go to the ultimate definition of the best tactics was the one that Georges Danton mentioned way back in 1792, which is like 100 and... I don't know. You just count, because this is 2012, it was 1792. His definition of tactics, which is, I think, a universal lesson, is that the best tactics is contained in this phrase. Audacity, audacity, and more audacity. You have to be bold, because by your own action of boldness, you go beyond the line of what is being dictated by the powers that be. That in itself changes the power dynamics. That is the best kind of tactics, and let us all be imaginative of what will be that action of boldness. And we have, I think, been doing a lot of that, and we just have to continue to absorb and learn the lesson. The second point I'd like to go to in terms of tactics is that as much as possible, there has to be an economic impact of what we do. Look at what is happening to Rush Limbaugh now when the sponsors are retreating. If our actions will have both a political statement, a cultural content, and an economic impact, that makes a wonderful tactics. Because when it hurts them in the stomach, because they don't get money, they will have to yield. So find out what is the kind or form of tactics that will captivate people's political and ideological imagination, as well as something that really hits the pocket of the powers that be. And the third and last point I'd like to say regarding, tactics is that, and this is where I think the value of the conversation between violence and non-violence come in. At least in my experience in the Philippines, what I found as the most wonderful tactics are the form of tactics or action that many people, the mass of people, can apply. The mass of people can embrace. Armed struggle might be a tactic, but it can only be reserved to people who love military action and arms. Let us think of a form of struggle that will enable each and every man and woman in the U.S., young and old, citizen and non-citizen, to come out into the street, to stand out and boldly to hold their post, because they're convinced of the fact that they are doing is something that is moral, something that is right. That is how a people power movement will come. So that is just a general lesson. Let us find some specific truths in the U.S. But it's a very long-winded question.
We're going to take a couple of more questions, and then we're going to actually do. I would like for us to take some moments to talk to each other after a couple more questions. Yeah.
So I'm really struck by just your energy and the power, and actually all of you, just in terms of your energy and commitment. I see you all as elders in these movements, regardless of your age. And my question to you all is, as folks who've been in it for the long haul, what is the source of your energy? What is the source of of that commitment? Sort of bring it to maybe a little personal level or a communal level. Just sort of wondering, what's kept you in it?
Well, for me, it's a spiritual / religious / ethical way of understanding the world. For me, God is not king, lord, judge, etc. For me, that classic Hebrew name of God is not Hebrew. That YHWH name is not Yahweh or Yehovah. It's without any vowels, and I often ask people to try it themselves, but I'll save time by doing it. It's the breathing that intertwines all living beings. It's not just that it intertwines all human beings. It's not. That's why I said it's not Hebrew. Breathing is not Hebrew. It's every language, and we only get to breathe in what the trees breathe out, and they breathe in what we breathe out. My sense of that as divine, as life breath, that's what keeps me going. The wisdom that you pause, whether it's a seventh day for the whole 25 hours, or it's meditation, or it's pausing in front of the food to say, wow, just imagine the sun, the rain, the soil, the seed, and human beings all weaving themselves together to make it possible for me to live. That wow is one of the things that keeps me going.
Okay. When you ask the question about what it is that keeps you going, I think that for me, it has always been the understanding that within everyone else is a part of me, and so collectively, we are all something, and we are all what is life. And so the task for me each day when I get up and I do my meditations is to please allow me to see the God in you. And sometimes it's very hard. And so I think that once you do that and you are able to make that connection with another entity, with another, no matter what it is. I mean, I can cross the Schuylkill River on the train and it takes my breath away. So there is that sense that we are all part of something, and that as a result of being part of something, I have a responsibility towards you. And we have one towards, you have one towards me, and that if we get to the point that we can get everybody to see that, and to stop looking at what our differences are, but to actually say, well, that every creation, in it there's a being, there's a something that we can connect to no matter how slight. And so the movement becomes very natural, because at some level you're looking to connect to that. So that's the essence of what it is. And of course I identify with people who are the underdog. And so consequently, because I can see me there. And it just makes sense. So that I believe in the rights of so many to exist, because we're all here to share this planet. So I believe in the right for all of these things to exist, and I just believe that somehow in the grand scheme it really can be done peacefully. I think that we just have to just re-examine how we look at each other and how we look at our coexistence on this earth. So I don't know if that's an answer for you, but I mean that's sort of what floats my boat.
Did you want to respond?
I also feel like we're going really late, so.
Okay, I actually would like to respond to that because I haven't talked. I get asked this a lot, and it is that I feel like we are just visiting the planet. Like we're just visitors. I'm visiting planet Earth. It's a very interesting place. And I have nothing but, I can't think of anything else I'd rather do with my time. And I feel like the only reason that we're really here is to love each other and to try to make a difference in each other's lives. Like that's really kind of it. And so what else could we be doing? Like I do this because I can't not do it.
Exactly.
Really, honestly, when it boils down to it. And I've been doing it for, 30 years at this point. And we'll probably keep doing it because I can't not do it. Really. It's fun. Best times I've ever had have been head first into a direct action, about to get arrested, tie me up, cops, kind of time. Truth be told. It is now 8:40, and I think, do folks want to just keep going with this, or would you like to kind of have a chance to talk to each other? I'm going to do a quick check-in.
Each other.
Huh?
Each other.
Each other. Okay, so what I was going to suggest is that we're going to just right here, if you guys can all just kind of turn around and in a small group of about 4 or 5 people, and just kind of do this, 4 or 5 people, turn around and just kind of what we'd like you to do, and I think the screen has gone down, but we'd like for you to just kind of share with each other some of your thoughts about what you've heard this evening, we'd also like for you to think about what are some of the strategies that particularly impacted you, and what are some of the things that you've heard this evening that you think might be a really good strategy for your work or work that you're watching, or what you'd like to see happening as we try to build a movement together.
During martial law. Oh, if you were in a group. That just
changed. So, anybody want to share some of the things that came up in their small groups? I'd like to see, why don't we start over here? There was a small group over here. Bao, you were a part of one of those groups. Does anybody want to say what came up for them? No? You have nothing to say? No, it's fine. Start with whatever. Just if you could, add just a couple of things, 1 or 2 things. Go for it.
One thing is that we think that One thing that we think that would help a lot for the movement would be just more people. A lot more people. Yeah. And then so trying to reach out and get more people and develop those relationships that was discussed, etc. And is there anything else that we should?
We also quickly touched on outreach to people, and that since there's not a physical occupation now, to be more visible, that maybe if marches were to happen, to do them through places that weren't necessarily the downtown area, but through the communities out of the center city, to really reach the population that's going to need this even more, to show them that we're there and they can come with us.
Great. Thank you. Anybody else from over here want to say anything?
One of the things that was mentioned was just about the audacity being valuable, but also absurdity. There was a story about Milosevic's picture being put on a barrel and people encouraged to put money in it for his retirement fund. And if you couldn't because you didn't have any money because of his policies, then you could hit it with a baseball bat, and it got to the point where the police actually had to protect the barrel and sort of arrest it. Take it away. Yeah, that's amazing. Or just things like that. Things that are both symbolic but very active, and maybe, I don't know. That's kind of what stuck with me from our conversation.
Right. Audacity and absurdity. Okay, why don't we go right in here? I'm gonna go around the room, folks, everybody. From the small group area right here.
Well,
you have
like any good anarchist, I did not join a group. I just spoke to this young lady here, to Jenna.
You want to use the mic so that
we exchanged some life stories. But we're both photographers, so we take that as our mitigating circumstance. And I just want to say that I've been following the Occupy movement from a distance. I'm a writer on about the big picture. I have a blog. It's called otherjones.com. And my latest blog is over there on the table. There are 4 or 5 copies if you want to get it. And I really like the idea of the absurdity. Having lived some time in Eastern Europe, it's typical of the kind of thing Eastern Europeans would do. There's a story that was told to me when I lived in Poland, way back behind the Iron Curtain, which was a little bit more sinister, which was during the war, people would, Poland was bombed a lot, and there were a lot of ruins, and people would stand on a dark street with a brick in their hand, and they would hold out the brick, and the implication was that either you gave them some money or you get a brick on the head. That's less fun than the barrel, but it's typical of Eastern Europe too. Okay.
Thank you. You want to? Yeah. Right here.
You want it? I'll start it.
No, you all.
Okay. It seems like the main thing that that came out of our group is that there's no shortcut to trust. So saying you have an agreement about what type of tactics you're going to employ, and if somebody breaks that agreement, then what can you do? Well, it's sort of a sign that you messed something up in the planning stage. That you're not going to go to the police and invoke some sort of legal restriction or something, because that's not what's encouraging people to follow whatever the agreement is, but rather because they've come to some sense that we're in it together and that we owe this to each other because we're in a reciprocal relationship. And if we don't do that, then we're violating the community of which we are a member. And so for us, it sort of became a question of before you can ever get to these discussions about whatever action you're going to plan, you have to build, even if it's not like a formal group or whatever, you have to build some space where everyone sort of owns themselves in that space, and that they are a part of it, and that they have some responsibility to the other people that they're working with. So that's what I got anyways.
Okay. Well, I guess we go. Yeah, we'll circle back around. We're coming to you. I promise.
Two ideas that came out of our group. One was somebody said we should start a radio station. I think it's a great place for the humor and the stuff we're talking about. Maybe like on the internet if we can't get the band.
We have one.
Okay, what is it? Where is it?
It's on the phillymedia.org website.
Right on.
Check the link out for Prometheus as well.
The other idea that folks discussed. Awesome. The other idea folks discussed was that perhaps we don't need to take the economic or political power firstly, but perhaps we can change beliefs, as in we're all connected, there is enough, we don't have to fight each other, and might motivate a release of that. That was an idea we kicked around.
Great. Can we come up? I'm sorry, I'm sending you all over the place. White sweater right here. Yeah. Yeah.
But we had 4 in our group, and one of the things that rose up was the huge mass of communication and that's around us, and the impossibility of keeping track of everything, and the feeling of not being sure of what we know. But what came up was that when we turn inward to meditation and prayer, we can find our way, and that what we need seems to be coming to us right when we need it, when we're following a leading of the Spirit. And that several of us are having that experience directly, which supports that thought. Do you want to see some more?
Very well put.
What about the folks behind you?
We highlighted some of the things that we particularly appreciated about the speakers, the examples of humor, the catapulting of the teddy bears, and the seminar on war tax resistance. We really liked those ideas. And the idea of direct action, direct being opposing what we are against, and action creating the community that we want to create. And we talked some about, well, how do we really create the community that we want to, how do we create a society that isn't based on capitalism? But we didn't have too many answers.
I'd like to see us address the basic beliefs that created the economic nightmare that we see us in and led to the creation of Occupy, the Occupy movement. We're looking at this from the standpoint of behaviors, and it is basic beliefs that created these behaviors. The war machine, the 1%, know very well how to get people to behave by addressing these basic beliefs. And I don't have time to mention them now, but I think we need to look at what underlies what causes people to behave the way they do.
Okay. The folks back. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I was from the same group as just gave two impressions of what we said, and I wanted to just throw out there that I have become becoming convinced that since most people are talking about trying to create something new, and most people are aware that the system is not going to respond to our knocking down offenses or standing in front of banks or anything with largesse, but rather with more violence and more ignoring us. I think most of us are becoming convinced that we have to just do productive things, and then the question is, well, what? Your group couldn't come up with how to replace capitalism by ourselves, and our group couldn't quite either, but I think that what we did at Dilworth felt to most people like the only possible solution, and it wasn't much, but it was the only possible solution. And I hope that we focus our direct action when we are ready to focus direct action on really discussing and believing in the fact that all we can do is refuse to participate. All we can do is make fun sit-ins to show people what humanity can look like, which is, well, anyway, we could do it really well if we were conscious that that's what we're doing. Instead of at Dilworth, we weren't quite conscious that that's what we were doing, so we didn't discuss any of this. We decided to discuss differences, discuss strategies for begging the mayor for more time or permits or whatever, and we sort of missed the whole point of what we were actually doing that made everyone feel good, which also resonated, I'm sorry to be going on for a while, but with what Cindy said, that she felt great because she felt for a moment sort of this cooperation of activists. And that's what we who were there, and that's why Occupy feels good across the country, is those who are there know that something happened, and it's impossible to describe to anyone else. And so we should stop worrying about describing it to other people, stop worrying about doing all the radical revolutionary things that make enemies for us, and just enjoy ourselves and refuse to participate in anything that we don't feel comfortable with, and then people will come, hopefully. And if not, then we have no chance anyway, but the first thing we have to do is just forget about fighting the government and begging the banks, because they're not going to do anything, and then figure out how to make a beautiful tent city that we can all live with in dignity, and let everyone see what dignity looks like too, which is, whatever, would be very nice. Thanks for your time.
I just wanted to add on to what you were saying about how Dilworth and others occupies in cities all over the country and really all over the world. Definitely a really good example of this is how it can be done. fantastic. But the thing that when that came up in our group, the thing that kind of struck me was so many of the things, like the elements that Occupy, like the various committees relied on, such as the food committee, we're still very reliant and dependent on capitalism as a system as it exists in our society. The food, for instance, I believe most of it came as donations from businesses, capitalist institutions. So the question that I had was, okay, yeah, this microcosm definitely works as it is right here. How do we spread that outward? How do we decapitalize food production and distribution? How do we, get away from, like the example of the generators being shut down and people bringing in like bike generators. Well, those bike generators had to be manufactured somewhere. So I think I'm just kind of running on with you guys. All get the idea, but I think it can be done. It's just a really, really, really long way to go. With a lot of institutions that need to be sort of broken down and looked at how they can be done differently.
Thanks. I'm going to ask for one more person. It's 9:15. We need to start wrapping up, and I want to just maybe ask one more person. Does anybody, one more person, and then I'm going to ask our panelists if they just have a final closing thing that they'd like to say.
I think it's fitting that the rest of my group left. In part because what they were talking about was being involved every day from the beginning in September until when things closed down at Dilworth, every day. And the way that tired them out, and the rest that they're needing right now. And part of the conversation as we had that was how to oscillate between action and rest until we find that place that the Tao talks about that is not doing. It's a long journey to get there, but in the meantime there's that oscillation. The other thing that we talked about was the oscillation between campaigns, direct action, and so on, and the mass-based movement, and how the connections between those are important to maintain, as well as seeing on-the-ground movement in a particular area, and how to find some places where we could come around and do that together.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask and go down really quickly. I know this is hard. We want to let the staff here go home at a time where we're not holding them late. So I'm just going to ask you if you have just kind of a, from this evening, closing thing that you'd like to say. And Cindy, I'm going to start with you on the end.
Okay. Mostly I just want to thank the folks who organized this for creating this space. I was almost going to start tearing up when people were reporting back. I just feel like part of the whole process of this is us doing it here. For me, like, how does revolutionary transformation happen? It actually happens partially by us having all these dialogical moments, which we don't usually get in the rest of society, to actually question things and strategize together, and that changes over time. And I just am continually moved by how profoundly those conversations change over time, and this reflective space really is important. But on the other hand, I just also want to have us come away with that. I really, really liked what you said about audacity and boldness and creativity, and I think we've forgotten that, those of us involved in Occupy Philly. And part of it is audacity to actually question the power structure over us that doesn't let us have the world we want, and start just trying to create power too, but the power to do things together, horizontal power. And I feel like it isn't just us being nice to each other and trusting each other. It's also us, continually pushing. And I really like the way you say our part of tactics is that we're, taking more power together and pushing back at power over us. And I really hope we can remember that. And lastly, I hope we can try to remember also as we come out into what we hope is a spring, this blooming of Occupy again, that won't happen unless it's all of us and many, many, many more people participating. It isn't just going to happen, which I feel like everyone's kind of waiting for it. And part of it's us thinking about what do we want to happen, and then figuring out all the roles that will take, and not seeing each of that we all need to do different roles that we feel comfortable in, and all those roles together, if we have conversations, will actually let us be stronger.
Thank you.
I guess what I take away from this is more that as long as there is, as long as you're questioning the way things are, then that's what makes it possible to change. But it's the questioning itself that's most important. And the moment that you stop questioning, stop and look at yourself and know that that's not where you want to be. You want to always have a question and seek an answer.
Well, it's interesting. Looking back on what I did say, I realized one of the most important strands for me of this last 40-some years has been my deep involvement in a religious community that was willing to connect with other religious communities and yet draw on its own sense of itself. You talked about cultural connection, and that's one of the cultural connections in this society. I've been drawn again and again and again to the memories of the origins of what the Jewish community sees as its origins, no matter what they were, of the overthrow of Pharaoh, and the origins of both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity in the struggle against Caesar, and the origins of Islam in the struggle within Mecca against the power elite of Mecca. And that I think there is something deeply instructive to us, whether we want to fit inside those cultures or not, deeply instructive to us in remembering those moments and understanding how they looked like they were caught in disaster. Pharaoh, Rome, Mecca, caught in disaster. And yet, the disaster itself led to an awakening that created new forms of culture and new forms of community. I think we're in a moment really like that, when the old forms of Judaism and Christianity and Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam and all of them are in earthquake and stumbling in earthquake. And I keep wistfully looking for the metaphor of learning to dance in an earthquake instead of stumbling. It's really hard when the dance floor itself is shaking and wobbling and moving and turning and what have you. But I think that's what we need to learn to do, is to dance in the world earthquake that we're all caught in now.
I just want to say thank you for the conversation and the discussion and our weaving together the ideas that we have, because it's very important. While looking at the example of Occupy Wall Street or Occupy Philly is a wonderful process, there are a lot of other things to occupy. And coming from a country that had managed to free ourselves, but I discovered that we couldn't really get out from it. I just want to say that there's importance in the movement here, and probably the heart of the thing that we need to do in the movement building in the U.S. is to occupy the occupied mind and liberate it. And I think we'll result in a lot of ways. Thank you very much.
Wow. All right. So thank you all for coming. And do you want to say anything to folks?
Thank you very much for coming. If you haven't, there's still room in the Nonviolent Warrior training on Saturday. You can sign up. Come back next week for A Force More Powerful. And we are planning to have a second phase focusing on analysis, vision, strategy, movement building, practical organizing skills, and possibly a real focus on economic justice. So if you want to get involved, sign up. And thank you so much for coming.